Theoretical concepts, particularly when we talk about race, whiteness is huge and important to understand. So there's a lot of researchers have talked about how whiteness becomes invisible or normalized. And it's really important for white people to start to mark their whiteness and to understand their whiteness and what it means to be privileged and how to use their privilege to bring about social justice. And so there's this scholar, and she breaks down whiteness into these three characteristics. And so, yeah, it's really important to understand that whiteness is a location of structural advantage, regardless of whether you chose it or not. Right? That's what privilege is. It's a location that you didn't earn, or it's a location of privilege that you didn't earn or do anything. It's just the way the world is set up, right? And systems like the education system, like property, like how you're treated by the law, by police officers, right, is set up for the structural advantage of white people, right? And to acknowledge that and be aware of that. Right, take for example something like the United States Congress, right? Barack Obama was the fifth black senator, right? Fifth. So we've been a country for 200 some odd years, and we've had 5 black senators. Oh, 6 with Kamala Harris, right? Which is good to see, right? And now she's running for vice president. But yeah, so it's just an example of the overrepresentation of white people in certain institutions, right? And the underrepresentation of people of color. A standpoint, yeah, whiteness is a position from which to view the world and to make sense of it, right? It's not normal, quote unquote. It's not a normal standpoint or a bird's eye view or an objectively true standpoint. It's just a standpoint, right? And oftentimes, because of structural advantage, white folks actually can't see a lot of the oppression and the privilege that they get because they're blocked by their privilege. So standpoint theory sort of tells us that people who are oppressed, right, often have a better view of oppression and a better understanding of systems of power because they're the victims of it, right? And one of the characteristics of privilege is a kind of oblivion, right? You're oblivious to it. You don't know. You don't know what it's like to have cops harass you, right? You don't know what it's like to not have access to something, right? So this kind of like privilege often goes with a kind of unknowingness, but it is a standpoint from which to make sense of the world. It's also a set of core values, practices, and norms in which white ways of thinking, knowing, and being and doing are normalized. Yes. So that it is associated with practices and norms, right? And oftentimes people will say like, "Oh, I don't have culture. We just do white things," right? And so it's important to unpack those and say, well, what are those practices? What are those norms? What are those thoughts? Right? What are those ways of being? What does it mean to be white? Right? And there's actually a funny website. It's called what's it called? Like thingswhitepeoplelike.com. And it's funny because of the ways that whiteness becomes invisible and you don't think of it as a culture, as you don't think of it as practices and norms. So it's like the top 100 things that white people like.com, and it's like, it's coffee, yoga, San Francisco, hiking, and it sort of like ultimate frisbee, and it like really unpacks, well, what does it mean to be white? And it often strikes you as white, or strikes you as humorous because it hasn't been, we don't mark whiteness in the same way that we mark other ways of being and racial others, right, quote unquote, right? And so it's interesting to take whiteness and to actually market. And so I think that's the comedy. It strikes us as funny sometimes because I think those things are true, right? Comedy. Sometimes we laugh because there's a truth there, and so it really kind of highlights really practices and norms that are associated with whiteness. Yeah, check it out. It's a website called what is it, like thingswhitepeopleLike.com, and it's like the top 100 things. Again, intersectionality is an approach to understanding how socially constructed categories of difference, race, gender, class, sexuality, operate in relationship to each other. Yes. So um, how is race? How does race modify gender? How does gender modify race? How does class modify race and gender? Right? How do race, class, and gender and sexuality all work together? That's an intersectional lens, and this is the kind of lens that more and more people are taking when they talk about social categories. They're not just talking about race, but they're talking about like race and gender and class, right? And how they modify each other.